So let's move on to creating some radio buttons. The way that radio elements behave is quite an interesting one. So in this lesson, we're going to dedicate it to learning how to bind values to a radio, but also learning how to unbind them. And I'll explain what this means as we go. So because this is a radio set, we're going to have 3 different radio buttons. If you haven't seen a radio button before, you're about to learn. Because these act slightly differently, we don't want to start off with a label. So we're going to start off with a div to then contain all of our radios. So what the purpose of our radios here is going to be is to dictate whether something is in the promotion. Remember, if we go into our model, we also have our new or limited, which also means that we can not specify it. So we can essentially select whether it's new, we'll select whether it's limited, but of course, if we then select one, we then get stuck. How do we undo that change and basically deselect a promo option? Because we want to essentially just remove it from the data where we then go and save things to the back end. So that's what this lesson is about, and it's quite an interesting way that we can do things. And then you'll learn a bit more about how Angular then handles our data when we are property binding. So inside, we're going to start off with a p tag. This is then going to contain the word of promo. If we save things out, we then have a section where we're going to allow us to then select those promo options. Before we go any further, let's add some classes. We're going to call this the donut-form-radios. And for the p tag, we can say donut-form-radios-label. We're not going to style it just yet. We can bind some elements and then continue. So let's start off with a label. Inside, we can then create another input, but this is going to be with a type of radio. We can then give this a name. Now, as we mentioned, the name's value, name, price, promo, is what we're going to be then looking for. And I really like the way that our input types of radio all then have the same name and then automatically group themselves together. We also want a value property, which we're just going to leave as empty for now. So if we save this out, we can see something like this, which just gives us a small dot that we can then go and click on. But we can obviously unclick it. And we also don't know what we are selecting. So if we add a span tag, we can say none. And then we're going to provide 2 more options, new and limited. So essentially, we're going to end up with something like this. So we're going to take a quick break and then style these radios. So if we jump down into our styles array, we can add some backticks and inside a top level class for our donut form. Now this is called the dash radios. So we want to then inherit our donut form. We're going to add a simple display of flex. We can align content with a value of center. If we then save this out, you can see that our radio will then be on one line. However, we have the label inside, which is then causing us some problems. So here, if we add a display flex, we can then align items with a value of center. We can then hit save, and you can see the text choice of our word of none then appears nicely next to our radio choice. However, it kind of looks a bit confusing. So we want to add a span tag, which then highlights our label of none. And then we'll give it a different color. So here we can say color and then hash 444. And you can see that our none also has some margin at the bottom, which is then pushing it upwards. So we just go ahead and remove that. We can say margin bottom with a value of 0. So we end up with something that looks like this. And it's quite nice when we then go and select it. We can then see what option has been selected. So with this in mind, we're pretty much done from a styling perspective. There's one more thing that we're going to do, and that is add a slight bit of margin for our label. We can then say margin dash right and 10 pixels. This is just going to push our element over ever so slightly to give it a bit of breathing space, because I like to make sure our design is also as good as our code. So jumping back to our radios, we're pretty much done in terms of the markup. However, we're missing our 2 options. So if we go and duplicate this, we can then change this over to new, change the last one over to limited. We can then hit save. We can then see none, new, and limited. So this works absolutely perfectly. And I think it's quite clear of which option we have then selected. So now it comes where we want to then bind it to our form model, which means that we can then turn to our friend ngModel. So if we go and add ngModel, and ngModel, we can then hit save. We have this promo option, which has now been added. What we want to now do is specify a value. So you can see that we have this one highlighted. That is because it's an empty string. If we change this over to A, it's then going to try and bind to an empty string because that is the value. So it's then choosing the last item which is available. So it's interesting by implementing these frameworks to learn how the web actually works behind the scenes. So what is the value going to be for this? If we turn to our donut model again, we have limited lowercase and new lowercase. So this is self-explanatory. We can add limited, we can then add new. We can then hit save. We can then select new. We have our string of new. We have limited, which is a string of limited. So that works absolutely perfectly. However, what if we want the value of none? We have an empty promo property. Now this might not be a bad thing. We could, of course, when we submit the form, intercept this property and say, is it an empty string? Just simply go ahead and remove it. But I don't really like that approach, and I think there's a better way that we can do things. So what we can in fact do in our value case is use some property binding. So why? Property binding then enters the world of plain JavaScript. So by default, we are binding a string here. When we property bind, we're passing JavaScript. So if I type the word new, this is then going to syntax highlight it, whereas this isn't. If we then put some quotes around this then essentially makes this and this 100% equivalent. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. So why am I telling you this? Can we use the value of null perhaps? We can then hit save. We can then go new. We get new. We can then click none. We then have null. So null doesn't quite work. What about undefined? If we add undefined, we can then hit save. We can select new, limited. Now if you watch, when we hit none, our promo property is obliterated from our object altogether. From my perspective, this is a perfectly great use case for property binding and then passing a value of undefined, which means that when we select that particular promo, it will just simply remove it altogether. So at this point, we can then submit our form, post it off, and we're not adding pointless properties that are never used to our data structure payload. And that is pretty much it for this lesson. We've learned how to bind to our generic inputs, which allow us to then type things such as the name and the price, but we've now focused on the input type of radio. Using a value, we can then specify it. So then whenever the radio is then selected, it populates that model with that chosen option, or unpopulates the model when we specify a value of undefined. So this is a great little use case and a small tip to dealing with template forms, and then unsetting those values when it comes to dealing with radios. So let's jump into the next lesson and continue our forms journey.